Welcome back to our Python Quickstart tutorial series. Today's topic is object-oriented programming in Python. These topics include the definition of classes, the concept of inheritance, and operator overloading. Before we conclude this chapter, I want to show you in another short video clip how we could debug these operator overloads. I want to just show you, if this seems too complicated, how you could potentially figure out how that stuff can work. I want to make here a second class. So all I do is I go here, I copy that. And I want to start here. With an alternative vector class. And I want to make this vector class crazy noisy. And all I do is what I would normally never do, other than for crazy debugging. I would never write print statements in any of those, because that makes it very noisy. And we're going to see this in a moment. And I'm just using here things entering, underliner, init. And let's just help us to say what went into that init. In that init went the vector. Then I have here string. Represent. So we see how I can make a very noisy class here. That is add. The argument was w. Let's call subtract. That is get item with I and that is set item as the arguments I and X. So I modified my vector class, made a very noisy vector class, and let's execute this. Here. And I want to make this, I need to break this into multiple steps because that's going to be very, very noisy. I want to make this a little bit simpler.
Would you like it louder or softer?
That was just Siri being a bit too noisy in the background. Okay, let's have a look how those operations work now to understand classes a bit better. First, I'm calling here the constructors. We see what happened. The first line called underliner init with their argument. The second one called underliner init with this argument. What happens if we do print? The print class simply calls the conversion to a string and then prints the representation of itself as a string. What happens if we do print u plus v? The print command immediately calls the string command of u plus v. U plus v calls what? That's actually self first. This is u, underliner, underliner, add with the argument w as the second argument. Let's look at the add function. What's happening next? The add function is calling get item with index 0, 1, and 2. The add function is calling here vector object with index 0, 1, and 2, and that calls the get item with 0, 1, and 2. So that's what we see here. Then what is that init? The init function that we see here is the return value. The add function has to return a vector object. So this line calls the init function, then returns this. So now we figure out again the string, and that's when the print command calls again the string on the new vector, and it prints the result. Similar things here, and let's make that a bit nicer, a bit different. I do it with a minus. The minus called the subtract method. The subtract method also needed the indexing of the second, and then it just created. What's the init? The init is in the subtract function, the return value. And now this return value is assigned to w. If I want to double check what that is, I could always just call represent w, and we see represent called the represent function and gives me this constructor that would create the vector w. That was a crash course on object-oriented programming. So what did we do with object-oriented programming? We created first classes as a combination of data and methods. We used inheritance to reuse certain functionality. Instead of copying code and modifying it, we inherit from the code, so we can learn anything that our parent learns instantly, and we only need to override what's different. And then we use that operator overload to create our own data types, our own fancy functions, our own smart data type that can do something really simple. And all these combinations are valid combinations. You will learn way more through our next exercise.